So this is an introduction to Project 6 for Design 103. I put the project sheets onto .ed for you. The project sheets, there's 4 of them. So here they are. The first one that you should definitely make yourself familiar with right away is the actual project sheet itself. So I think it's on as a PDF on .ed. Uh-oh, that's not it. Here it is, Project 6. Hopefully that's it. Yeah. And it's a little bit wordy because it wasn't quite a complex project that I've done for years with my Design 1 class. This is tailored to Design 1 for photo students. So Project 6, 35 points. So it's 5 points more than your normal projects. You're going to isolate or repeat a motif. And I'll be talking about what motif is in a minute. So repeated motif, development of a pattern using historical measurement repeat systems with applications of 4 color relationships this time: monochromatic, complementary, analogous, and triadic. So you'll be using the programs Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator. Part A, develop a motif that is composite photography and/or drawn or designed elements. It may be geometric or organic. Put it in grayscale so you can see the value contrasts and so that you can see its form objectively. In other words, with no color interference. Part B, choose a historical measurement repeat system, and I give you a list for that, and turn in a research written paragraph explaining the history and current usage of your chosen system. For research sources, use the recommended books: The Power of Limits, The Geometry of Design, the Art Center Library. You can also use for research and internet searches. A list of historic measurement repeat systems is given to you. Examples are the Golden Section, which was Greek, the Fibonacci series, which was Italian, the 1:2 ratio, Japanese, the grid, European American. All these systems can set up mathematical relationships that govern the proportions and ways in which your motif could repeat. Do an image that shows how your motif will repeat in a composition using the system you choose. So you'll design some motifs and run them past me. Things that you might be interested in working with. It can be more or less image oriented. It can be more or less abstract. It can be more abstract or less abstract. Part C, do 4 studies using the 4 color relationships: complementary, monochromatic, triadic, and analogous, using your composition from Part B as the structure. Use an Adobe Illustrator blend to create a palette, and I've done that. I showed you already for the last project. You may desaturate the color swatches in your palette by creating tints and shades. Label your studies: monochromatic, complementary, analogous, triadic. A lot of people didn't label, so it's easier for me when I see what you were attempting to do. So definitely label them. And then D was the one that we were always printing. We always printed, but now we're not printing them for this project because you don't have access to printers very easily unless you have one at home. So you're just going to make it a bigger composition, something bigger and more impressive than your studies. Confer with me to find the best color study and format a larger composition using the repeat as your final piece to turn in. So I'm actually asking you to choose which one you like the best. Some people last semester chose to show all of their color studies or made each one into a final piece, and that's possible. So I'm going to show you some examples of ones that were done in your class last semester. At the bottom of your project sheet, you can print these all out. They're on .ed, and I think I also emailed them to you last night. So there's a lot of copies that you can access in case you lose them. Turn in digitally 4 designated folders. Part A is the motifs. Part B, I'll go over this again later, maybe in a week or so. Part B is the written paragraph on a historical repeat system with a line drawing It doesn't have to be a line drawing. It can be a grayscale study because you're photographers. So line drawing is for the other class, which is primarily graphic art and illustration students. So they're not using photographic imagery, but since I'm letting you use photographic imagery, you could just do it in grayscale. 16 points for color studies, and then the final piece. So then you'll do a presentation to the class on the last day. That will be our last day, our critique, where we listen to people go through what they did. And I think the best way to do it is to have you send me the projects. I have them all in a folder, and I'll go through, I'll show the images as you talk. Because if you share your screen, I've heard that it gets a little complicated. So I think it's better this way. For me to have your projects earlier, make sure you get them to me before the final crit day, and then we'll go through them that way. So what's the purpose of this? I think you're going to find that you're going to be asked in design and in your work in the future to repeat things. How? And then you're faced with, well, how am I going to repeat this? Like, what system do I use to repeat things? So why should you not be familiar with historical ways that artists and designers, architects, engineers have repeated? In the past, I bring in my books, which is pretty extensive, for looking at ideas for signs, symbols, motif. That's how we're using the definition of the word motif, not as a theme, but as a sign or symbol, or a visual motif is how we're using this word. And then you're going to put it into some sort of system. So because of photographers, I included the rule of thirds. Maybe some of you have had experience with other systems of repeating. There's also measurement systems that dictate how you repeat things, such as geometric progressions, arithmetic progressions, Fibonacci series. These are all systems that have been found in nature extensively. So none of these are being made up by me. They've been used in design for centuries. So how are you going to do the research to find out about these things? Well, we are really challenged at this point because you're all in, lockdown. So I just got an email about the Art Center Library, which I think you've received too, and it's open for business. You can go on its site, and I'll forward to you the email that I received, because he said there's lots of ways in which you can get into the library and the books. So you could also use the internet, and people have said to me, I couldn't find anything. Well, when I put in Fibonacci series, I brought up like hundreds, if not thousands of pages of material. So it's not very hard to find once you pick a system. So let me show you the resource I give you to start to think about this. I gave you a list of measurement systems. So the I say some historic measurement systems that you might think about using to do the project: the Pythagorean triangle, the Pythagorean loop, the golden section, which can be manifest in a rectangle, triangle, or ellipse. The Fibonacci sequence, which is a sequence that shows up in nature in many instances of the way that things grow. Leaves on the stem of a plant, shells in the way that it expands outwards in the spiral. Different ways that animals reproduce. I think Fibonacci actually, it's said that he discovered it by breeding rabbits, and they bred in the Fibonacci sequence. Arithmetic and geometric progressions, which is the mathematical sequence, but easy to understand. Logarithmic spirals, spiral growth patterns, which you can research. Vitruvius's canon regarding human body proportions, squaring the circle, which fascinated Leonardo da Vinci and Albert Dürer, both artists that are pretty well known and were working in different parts of Europe during the Renaissance time period. Root rectangles, the 1-to-2 ratio, which governs how Japanese tatami mats were laid out and really in that way, also dictated a lot of measurements in their architecture. Tantric diagrams, the 9 triangles of the Sri Yatra. That's an Indian system, East Indian, not American Indian. Mandalas, circles of unity. A lot of students have been interested in that. They're used for meditating upon in many religions, such as Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam too. Rhombic cubes. The grid, which is a very modernist device, European, American. Prime number distributions, which I don't know too much about, but you could find out. Tessellations, which we all learn in grade school, but they're really fascinating when 2 shapes fit together with no space in between and become a pattern. Fractals, which computers generate, no repeating numbers, but it keeps on building the sort of structure. Reflection, mirroring, which comes out of duality. And finally, the rule of thirds, which photographers use a lot. So you can see that there's many, many systems that you can choose for that you could make into an image. That sheet is on .ed in this week's area for .ed for your class. And I also sent it to you. I emailed it to you. So the books that can be used for this project, I put some up. I don't know exactly how you'd get a hold of them now. You could rent them before from the student store, and I'm sure that you could get a hold of it through the bookstore, but I'm not sure how they're working that. You might be able to get into one of the books by going on Amazon or even by in our library. I'm not sure how, but this is a problem right now, but it won't hurt. It won't, we have the internet, so you have lots of ways to do research. But these are some of the books that I found really interesting, the most important ones. These 2, I have 4 or 5 copies and I would bring them to class. Unfortunately, I can't do that right now.
Can you try to scan them?
Have I tried to scan the whole book?
Oh, the necessary parts that you feel are necessary.
Wow. Well, actually, the power of limits, if you want to order it right away, maybe it would come if you ordered it right away from Amazon. That book is amazing, and I maybe should read you the foreword because it's so moving. The whole book is very, very useful, full of really interesting diagrams and material. The guy who wrote it was older, like 75, and he was an engineer, and he'd been fascinated by this material his whole life. And he goes over many of these systems and also shows their correlation to music and musical structures, same sorts of, the same ideas in music. So it's really fascinating. It's also not very expensive to buy. It's about a 25, here, I'll show it to you.
It is 26 point something, but
yeah. So it's not very expensive. It looks like this. And it's a totally wonderful book. Somebody said to me, they saw me in the hall up at the hillside one time, and they said, Miss Khan, I just bought that book that you told us to buy 2 years ago. That was like 2 years later. And they said, it's really great. And I'm like, I told you to buy it 2 years ago. 2 years ago. But anyway, it's a totally amazing book. This one I saw in the bookstore at Art Center that another class was using years ago. So I bought it and I really liked it. And for some strange reason, this little book is taken a lot from me. 2 or 3 of them have just disappeared. It's the oddest thing, not the other one, but this one. People love this book and somehow they like to pilfer it. But it has really interesting overlays in it. It's got a lot of applications for design and product design students. So yeah, lots and lots of product design diagrams, different famous product design and graphics, but especially the overlays. It'll show you how a graphic was actually designed in terms of some of these systems. And they do overlays to show you how famous famous furniture and car design have had some of these repetition systems. So one thing I have to say, I have to put in a plug for the Art Center Library because we are a design school. So you're actually going to a school that has one of the best libraries, if not the best design library in LA. You know, they collect these books. That's what we are. We're a design school. So yeah, so I would say in the future, when you get back to school, take advantage once they design a vaccine for this horrible virus. So one more sheet that I give you, and maybe, Jennifer, I will try to scan some parts of that book. It's actually a little bit of a transgression, I think, to scan a lot of it because it's copyrighted. But yeah, so let's see, one more thing that I give you is a bibliography. And this is a bibliography format because I would like you to have 3 sources for your information. You're going to write a paragraph on your system. So you have to do a little research and really, you know, learn a little bit about the system that you're using. So here's the sample bibliography for a book and for a website. So for a website, you include the author, the article, if there is one, where it comes from in the URL. And for a book, the author, the title, who published it, and what page, when it was published and what pages you used. But if you can't figure out what the article is called and who wrote it, then at least give me the URL, okay? So you could just copy 3 URLs.
Okay. Joan, could you show some examples of how we're supposed to repeat the objects, or like, I don't get, like, what is the final visual project we need to have?
Not only am I going to do that, but I'm going to start to give you an introduction right now to the whole project, okay?
Okay.
So here we go. So the first part of this lecture is about motif and pattern. And I am going to show you mostly what I did in the early part of my career as a design teacher. There's not a lot of photography in here because I haven't managed to work on this lecture, but I'm going to show you examples of what the photography students and art and photography section has done in the last 4 years. And I promise that I will be changing this lecture soon. I just haven't gotten around to it. You know, I don't know, it's really a lapse on my part. So this is a lecture just about what motif can be. But it can also include photographic motif is what I'm saying. And I'm going to show you examples of that. I just don't have them in this lecture. So to give you an idea of what motif has been historically in the arts, and just try to see some of these as also maybe photographic. Motif generally is rather simple. So if you're doing a figure or a leg or a face, keep it sort of simple, you know, unless you're doing something like maybe the Pythagorean lute. And I'll show you an example of that later where you just use one image that gets smaller and smaller. But in this case, this I thought was a motif symbolizing the idea or concept of dance because it was for a poster called Dance. And I thought it conveyed the idea really quickly and simply. Motif can also be really graphic. This is a design for, I think it was the 1984 Summer Olympics. And notice how simple these visual motifs are. Motif can be derived from letter forms, especially expressive letter forms, where the letter form actually conveys an idea, such as calligraphic or art deco, or hobo, contemporary, things like that. Expressive type can convey those ideas. Some people did their motif in the graphics, in the course I teach for graphics, was just letter forms. This was a fountain that I saw at the entrance to the historic harem in Istanbul when I visited Istanbul. And I liked it because it had so many different motifs in it, so many different geometric clustering and groupings of motif. There were lots of stars in this part, and the whole thing looked like a big flower. It was a fountain.
So, Joan, what exactly is motif like?
Yeah, let's talk about the word motif. I'm using it as a synonym for something like a sign or symbol, a simple conveying of an image, you know, not complicated. So it would get an idea across very simply. In graphics, that would be a flat shape. In illustration, it might be something like a little cartoon figure coming out of a sandwich. It could be that complicated. It could be something a little bit more complicated in illustration. It could be a whole figure like Linus carrying his blanket. Or somebody biting into a hamburger. In photography, it could be something like an image of a rose or any photographic, but simple, keep it simple. I'm gonna show you a few examples, and I'm gonna show you more next time too. This is the, to keep going with the idea of motif, these are Islamic motifs. In Judaism and Islam, early parts of that religion forbade the representation of human figure and animal figure, so they used mostly vegetal and floral and geometric, a lot of geometric design. So this is Islamic motif. They also use the writing, the Arabic writing. Early American quilts, largely geometric. And the patterns that I think American quilts had are really interesting. You could put your motif into that. So now I'm getting a little bit into the grid pattern and how to actually use your motif in a system. So I have to say at this point, because I always interrupt myself here, that how you group things and how we perceive how you group things largely depends on the clustering of values, not just color. I think value and grayscale is just more important even. Notice here that we see diamonds, light and dark diamonds. It's actually something called the log cabin pattern in early American quilt making, where the whole thing was clustered, was built out of a square in the middle and strips that were sewed around it. But we see it as dark and light diamonds because of the way the strips are grouped in terms of their, and their value. This is a photograph that I took of a German facade, and I was interested in it because there were so many different motifs in the same photo. Here we have a picture of one of the ancestors, but it's a low relief, it's a sculpture. Here we have somebody, I think it was inlaid, looks like a psychedelic pattern. Up here we have coats of arms and low relief sculptures. I'm not sure what that is. Motif can also give us information about the history of an artist or the history of a place or an object. More importantly, maybe an object. So how you put the motif on something or what you decide to use in your artwork or your photography is greatly, has a lot of information in it about you as an artist and maybe you as yikes, or a culture. If you want, I can mute people, but I sort of like to hear you a little bit so I know I'm actually talking to people and not just my computer. Anyway, this was a chest that I inherited. It's right behind me here, actually. And whoops, I want to go backwards here. what's interesting here is that when I inherited this chest, I lived with it for 20 years without ever researching what the images meant. And a friend of mine said to me, have you ever looked into what that chest, where it comes from? And I said, my mother says it comes from the Black Forest. It's several hundred years old. And he said, well, I think you should look into what these symbols mean. So when I started to do that, I thought that this was a swan or a goose. And I thought there were little chicks here. But it turns out that she's pecking her breast. This is a really old symbol, and it represents the martyrdom of Christ, because when a bird of this type pecks their chest, they draw blood when there's no food to be had, and feeds it to their young. And it is not a goose or a swan, it's a pelican. And the pelican is famous for doing that. And it's actually quite a well-known symbol. This was also a symbol, it's the bleeding heart, and this has two chickens on top, which is unusual because the bleeding heart was a symbol in Eastern Orthodox Christianity for, again, the martyrdom, the martyrdom of Christ, or the Christianity. So what's interesting here is that I thought it was from the Black Forest in Germany, but it might be from Russia. And so then I just happened to meet somebody who was restoring, that was her business, restoring Russian icons and religious icons, little, those little folding things. And she said that she thought it was a marital farmer's chest because of the chickens and because of its shape. And so all of these things, made me understand this chest a lot better. So motif has a lot to do, you can use it as informational. This is a photograph of a cell structure, a pod, some other kind of pod or flower, grasses, branches against the sky. Every tree has a branch structure that is particular to that species. And I also started taking some photographs of packaging that had graphic or illustrative kinds of motif. This is a sculpture in Alhambra in an antiquity shop. I love the sort of form of these just sculptural forms. I thought were very traditional.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so anyway, we used to do this in grids when I first started teaching design, but now we're doing all the different systems that I just related to you. So I'm gonna go down this list here and show you some examples of when we started to do it at Art Center. Somebody did a drawing of a shirt and a hat without the figure. And then they did their paper. Then at that time, I was just starting this project. I let people just Xerox pages and show me what they'd learned. And then he painted it. So I have 5 art majors, fine art majors in this class, and you do not have to use photography. You can, your motif can be anything you want. You can paint it if you want. Or you can do it digitally, since it seems easier right now to actually work digitally since we're distanced, right? It might, and this is a project that lends itself to digital reproduction. It's actually quite a bit easier. For a long time, I had my fine art students paint it and do a digital, and it took a long time. So some of these are painted, believe it or not, and some of them are digital. This is the golden section. And the motif is simply one of these squares.
Joan, is there a way you can send these pictures or upload them to .ed?
I put some up.
Some, not, yeah,
I mean, I don't know how, and also I don't have permission from the students. This was a student who had a stepfather who was a cardiovascular surgeon, and he wanted to do the represent an electrocardiogram. So these were scrolls that he made finally with watercolor. This was somebody who was interested in Mayan motif and the rhombic cube.
That's
Cool.
That's cool. Yeah, it looks like the Platonic figures, like like a dodecahedron or something like that.
This is a woman who's interested in graphical interfaces. It's a depiction of her last 2 weeks in an art center semester. And what she did was she made a little key where she represented her moods and then put them all together. She literally put in a group of these bars every 4 hours or something. This guy actually became a really famous, I had him 15 years ago or more. He was in my first few, I've been at Art Center for 21 years. So he was in one of my first classes when I started doing this project, which has evolved over time, by the way. And he did drawings over cave painting, paintings that he saw, right? He did the drawings and then he picked one of them. And this is the Ulam spiral, which is an astronomical galaxy, and the distribution of prime numbers there. And he took that drawing and he put it into some color schemes. So I'm going to ask you, of course, the color schemes have changed. I used to ask people to do 3 analogous, 3 complementary, but now we're doing only 4 color studies using the monochromatic, complementary, analogous, and triadic systems. So yeah, a lot of beautiful images have related. What we're really trying to do, this is graffiti, is come up with a beautiful image. This was the Fibonacci series. The guy who did this, his motif was simply this funny little bar thing. I'll go backwards. This one was his motif. And then he put it into a layered system. So he was layering according to the Fibonacci series. This person drew a cell dividing. It was after his grandmother had died of brain cancer, just a few months earlier before he came to Art Center. So the negative space represents the brain cell dividing, if you can see that. And he ended up with these things that looked like stained glass windows. Let's see, there was a couple more. This woman was Chinese, directly from mainland China, and she used the butterfly. She ran into something that was extremely difficult to print because every single part of this is the replication or is generated by repetitions of butterflies. And the file became so large that she had a lot of trouble printing it. I had somebody last semester who got into that too, and he just kept duplicating and duplicating and went tiny, 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 smaller than you can see. And then and what happened was I'll show you his files in a minute, but the end file, although it was extremely beautiful, is difficult to print. It's so big, it's like 600 megabytes. So I'm going to now talk about systems. That was my little lecture on motif, but now I want to talk about systems. So give you a little talk on systems, and then I'm going to show you some examples, okay? Sorry that this is a little long, but I have to do it all today because we don't have that many sessions left. You have to start working on this. So today is the 6th. I think we have 3 more weeks. So the last session is going to be presentations of what you did. So we really have to start on this today because you've really only got 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks to work on it, something like that. All right, so teaching. So hold on a minute. Let me get it back into. Is that a dog or a person? It sounds coughing. Okay, here we go. man. Okay, hold on a second. I have to start it again. No. Let me try one more time here. That's not starting right. All right. Okay. So here's my first slide. Do you all know what this is?
Yeah, the
Stonehenge.
Stonehenge.
Stonehenge. Yeah.
It's Stonehenge, yes. So this is Stonehenge, and Stonehenge is a formation of rocks that was found on, is situated on Salisbury Plain in England. It was built by the Celts, 2000 BC is the date, and it has much has been discovered about it only in the last 30 years. In the 90s and the early part of this century, they've actually researched and discovered a lot more about it. One reason is because they excavated concentric mounds around Stonehenge and found inside those mounds, why they had never found it before, I don't know, but inside those mounds, they discovered remains of the Druids, who were the Celtic priests, and their tools and implements. So much more now is known about it. But what was a mystery for years was just how they brought these rocks. They're humongous. A person comes up to about right here. So how did they bring these rocks to the plain and put them upright? So actually there's quite a few structures in England and Scotland that are like this. So they found out that the Druids had ritualistic ceremonies that they used these formations for. So at the solstices, the sun actually rises in very strategic parts of these rock arrangements. As I said before, they just recently in the late 90s discovered, and you can look into this, discovered I hope I'm recording this. Yes, good. They discovered the implements that were used in some of these rituals in Stonehenge and know much more about it now. But the interesting thing is that they're arranged in circular formations. So you can look into that. Here are the pyramids. The pyramids use the golden section in their construction quite a bit. So I just wanted to show them because we always wonder how on earth did these things get built? How were the plans? They used the golden section. This was the Parthenon, sorry, in Greece. And it was a temple to in the devotion of Athena, but it also used the golden section. This is a diagram of the front of the Parthenon. And if you look, it's exactly the golden section in terms of how it was designed. The Pantheon in Rome is a structure with what was the biggest dome in the world for years and years. It's 40 feet across. So the Romans were really good at building domes. That's where the term, the Roman arch, comes from. It's a rounded structure, and the weight is distributed in a way that enables the dome to continue to exist. The round circle in the middle of the roof is called an oculus, which means eye of the gods. Actually, this structure was used as a calendar, as, by the way, some of the others were too, like they think Stonehenge was also a calendar. So where the sun shines through the oculus determines the time of year and day, maybe even. When I used to go in here, it was all empty. There was a little bit of water that came through the oculus, but that was about it. So it still exists in the center of Rome and you can go visit it. Again, this is a Roman structure built by the Romans to carry water from one side of the river to the other. This is near the city of Nimes in southern France. I was interested particularly in the proportions of these arches and how the little ones related to the bigger ones. I have to show you this because after I was in Marin County at one point, a friend of mine got married in this structure, which is the Marin County Courthouse. And it was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, who never gave anybody credit for some of the ways in which he was influenced by them and their cultures. But if you look at the aqueduct, this is an aqueduct built by the Romans in southern France, and Frank Lloyd Wright's structure spanning a highway in Marin County, it seems kind of similar. Things like the gardens at Versailles in France, how did they decide on the proportions and the structure of this? This looks quite similar in some ways to the Getty Garden by Robert Irwin that we have here in LA. The Eiffel Tower, how was the repetition of the cast iron structure, geometric structure, how did they decide on those repetitions? So that's some of those things I want you to think about in doing this project. Here are some examples, but I want to go on here, not with examples right now, but with some other real life examples. This is the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And I also am interested in Frank Lloyd Wright's decision to have 3 circular spiraling forms and a much larger one on top. What is the proportional relationship of those? Another building of his, Falling Water, same sort of thing. I'm interested in the proportional relationships and whether they were governed by systems that he didn't give credit to. So this is our Getty Center in LA. And the gardens that I was talking about before. The Getty Center was built all based on one rectangle or one square, I think, 32 inches by 32 inches originally. It may have transformed into 30 by 30, or it might be the other way around. But I know one of the right-hand architects, the people that helped build the Getty Center, the people that helped Richard Meyer in his architectural office, and he told me that the whole structure is based on one single measurement of a square. So this is actually my ex-husband looking at the gardens and one of the rectangles. The book that I was alluding to has diagrams like this. This is actually a tatami mat diagram, and it's the 2-to-1 ratio. So I got interested in that, the fact that tatami mats are always laid 2-to-1. So there's this long section here, long against 2, never 2-to-2. So I took some pictures of the tea house structure at I think it was the Huntington Gardens, or it might be Descanso. I think it's the Huntington, because I wanted to show you that it really exists that way. I mean, that look at this, there's 2 across and 1 at each end. Indian sand painting. How did that structure develop? Meandering by monks in monasteries in Europe. Fractals. These are fractals. In my book that I told you was so wonderful, The Power of Limits, there are diagrams of tantric squares, using the number 9, which is very, very important in Indian design. Now I want to talk a little bit about the use of the human figure in using these systems. And starting with the Egyptians, we had measurements that related to our body. So a lot of designers and architects have thought that we should design mostly using the human body as standards of measurement. So these were Egyptian measurements. This is a fist, and it's the measurement of an Egyptian foot, which was probably bigger than ours because it's actually a little bit bigger than our foot measurement. These are chorus figures, which the Greeks put on top of tombs to decorate the tombs. And I want to show this because what's interesting to me here is that even though they use the figure, the young man's figure, as a decoration of tombs for their whole art history, the figure changed, and the proportion, what the Greeks considered beautiful, changed over time. If you look at the, first of all, this was the Archaic period, this is the Classical period, and this is the Hellenistic period. You see that this is much more stiff, this is more naturalistic, and this becomes very fluid and liquid and naturalistic. But more interestingly, in terms of this lecture and what I'm saying in the lecture, the size of the head, notice that the size of the head was large, smaller, and even smaller. So in the end, the Greeks decided that small heads were much more beautiful to be used as measurement, which is pretty weird because in fact, I've read that the size of our heads is actually more like the head of the figure that they used in the Archaic period. We don't have tiny heads. The head on this figure is about 1/9 the size of the body, and it's generally about 1/8, I think. So the human figure, our perception of what's beautiful in terms of proportion has also changed with different cultures and time. These are all Greek. And finally, the diagrams that Leonardo da Vinci and Albert Dürer did using a Roman statue and diagramming it. So both of those artists were extremely interested in using the human figure as important in proportion and designing for use of, us, for our use. This is a man inscribed in a circle. It's very famous. Vitruvius, who was art historian, who wrote about Leonardo da Vinci and Albert Dürer and the Renaissance artists, also wrote about this diagram by Leonardo. So as I said, some artists thought that we should diagram or design always using the human figure. This is an architect named Le Corbusier. He was a very famous and very influential on design French architect. And notice in this diagram, you see that he said, well, we should design looking at human movement and human gesture. This is man sitting, man leaning, or human leaning and resting arms, reaching. The Fibonacci sequence, Le Corbusier was also interested in the Fibonacci sequence. The Fibonacci sequence also has to do with the golden section. So there's an interrelationship of a lot of these systems with each other, of course. So the Fibonacci sequence is 0 plus 1 equals 1. 1 plus 2 equals 3. 2 plus 3, you go backwards and you add up the last two numbers and it equals the next number. So 2 plus 3 equals 5, 3 plus 5 equals 8, 5 plus 8 equals 13, and so forth.
Yeah.
This is a Le Corbusier grid. And it's used in some of the other design classes I've noticed to design with. And finally, the golden section and how you construct it. Depending on what you're using to do your project, I can send you, or I can put up some of the ways in which these things are constructed. I have a handout on constructing constructing the golden section, and I have a handout on how to make a tessellation, but I don't want you to have to understand or to know these things mathematically. That's not what this project's about. It's about taking a diagram that you find online, giving me a short half-page explanation of the system and how it fit into human history and usage in human history, and then using that structure to put your motif in. You should not think that I want you to understand it mathematically and that you have to understand how to generate it mathematically. All you have to do is find the diagram and put your motif into it. So the book that people seem to love the most, this little one, gives a lot of diagrams that that artists and designers have used to design products. And I think that's one reason that it gets taken for some reason. It's weird, it's disappeared quite a bit. In the book is a diagram of the Volkswagen, the recent Volkswagen that Art Center, I think an Art Center alumni had something to do with. So when you start to research things, you're going to find some really interesting pages online. One person said to me, I can't find what I'm looking for. And I said, look, how easy. Look, I'm going to plug in the Fibonacci sequence. And pages and pages came up that looked like this. So don't tell me you can't find anything. Okay, now I'm going to show you some examples. So, this was a tessellation. You know, Art Center attracts so many extremely talented students. And just to show you, this girl actually drew the head of a geisha, or geisha, I'm not how you say sure, with a comb, and put it into a tessellation design of her own or that she found. So some of these things were generated. Now you're going to do it photographically. So you have to take the photograph yourself and then decide how you're going to use the motif within a system. Let me show you some examples.
But you said that the fine arts students, we could not photograph it if we want to, correct?
You can draw or paint it or scan it or Xerox it or however you want to do it.
Okay, thank you.
And I say Xerox, I don't mean take somebody else's material. I mean, we work with a Xerox machine to do something. I don't know. One girl painted something, she printed it, I think. So she ran it through a press, something through a press, like an imprint of something. And then she started to work with a Xerox machine and got some interesting images and used that as her motif. But I'm just saying it can be, you can generate your motif however you want. We are, right now, we're working, you know, in a distanced way, so it might be best if you take that thing and digitize it, just so you can put it into a system and repeat it. But if you want to do it analog, I guess we can take our phone and look at it. You can hold up the phone and show us what it looks like, and then we could, if you can take a picture of it, we can look at it online. But I haven't been really satisfied with the pictures that people have been taking of their work, by the way. So unless you get a professional photographer to take a picture of what you do, I think it would be best if you digitize it and then repeat it in a system using digital means, Photoshop, in other words.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. In my other class, they all had to paint the third project, and then they took a picture, and they were some of the worst pictures. I mean, they had glare on them. It was really hard to see the real piece. So I think it's best if we, since we're not in a classroom together in a face-by-face situation, I think it's best if, even if you start with a motif that was painted, I don't know in this case, you know, right now, it might be best if you somehow digitize it, but you can talk to me about that. Okay, so here are some of the ones that have been done in the past, and I'm trying to show you a real variety. This woman was a interaction student, and she wanted to do it on the computer and generate a pattern that was really kind of interactive. And she showed us, I can only show you the hard, the what, you know, was the, so she ended up, she designed these herself. They were geometric. Then she wrote the geometric grid, she called it. And these are AI files. This is a PDF. I don't know if I can, so this is her geometric grid system. And I want you to show me a picture of, why is this moving around? I want you to show me a picture of the system in black and white, what you designed. So it can be, with photographs, it could be grayscale, right? So you're gonna put them together in a certain way, depending on what you choose to use, and then show me a grayscale picture of that, or a black and white picture. Then you're also going to write, so she wrote a page about how she designed her geometric progression system. This is an interaction student, so they're very into math and geometry and repetitions. And then she put them into color. And some of the colored ones I thought were really beautiful. I'm showing you a real diversity. I'm gonna go to photographs next. So these are Illustrator files, actually. I'm only going to show you 6 different examples this time, but next time I'm going to show you more, okay? Because I don't have all the photographer's work. But she ended up with these images. And they were really, I'll show you the one I liked. This one, where the negative space kind of ends up taking over the space and being really interesting. So this was my absolute favorite of what she did. So that was completely geometric. Let's look at one that was photographic. So I think this was Johnny Perez's whole presentation. And I can't, oh, what was that? I'm not sure I can give you his presentation. I know I can't because I don't remember what he said. But he showed what a geometric progression is. This was about, I think it was a geometric progression, not a arithmetic progression. So basically, things that get added to each other to make it get bigger. So he was showing how these things develop, what it is. And he took a picture, he had a model that he used, and he took a picture of her in his backyard. So this was a picture, oh, they painted her body first. He and she painted the body, her body. And then he took pictures of her, and this was her pushing on a tree. And he ended up using this motif in the designs that I liked the best. and colored them complementary and analogous. That was before we did monochromatic and triadic. But here, I thought this image was interesting. These were neutrals, also complementary. This was complementary, pink and green, and monochromatic. So here he shows how the system applies to the motif. And believe this or not, Johnny did not really like digital. He liked to, he was a photographer who became a fine artist, but he wasn't very good at the digital stuff. So if he could do this, you can do it, because he came into my class and just constantly said, oh, you know, I'm not very good digitally. This was an arithmetic progression is what it was. I'm going to show you a lot of other works in the future that are more photographic, but let me show you a couple of others that are not. And unfortunately, when I do this analog, I start by showing you in the classroom about, I'm not kidding, 30 to 50 projects that were done in the past. So unfortunately, I can't do that because we're, you know, doing distance education here. This was done last semester by a woman named Max. Do you know her? She's a photographer. These are mostly, I'm going to try to put them into preview and see what comes up here. Whoops, that's not preview. Okay, let me do it again. Something's coming. Oh, yeah. So she, this is interesting. I never saw this before. I don't know if she showed it at her presentation. This was her grayscale image with a grid over it. This is her original photo and her motif. So she used one photo and didn't really use an independent motif. She used one photo and put a grid over it. And her final pieces, these were her color pieces. So people did this in different ways. They didn't all follow my instructions implicitly. And for, you know, this is her monochromatic. All right. Another one done by a graphics major. So here are his drawings for his motif. In theater and literature, motif is meant to be a theme like love or death or jealousy. In this case, we're using it more as a visual motif. So he showed me his original drawings were all animals. And he was going to try to put this animal into the golden section. But I said, when I looked at these drawings, I said, you know, that is the golden section. You know, it's your little drawings of animals, you don't have to repeat them into the golden section. A lot of people did a spiraling pattern, which I'm going to show you a lot of examples of next time, using the golden section and repeating. And I'm going to do a demo of how to do that in Illustrator, okay? So that you see me do it next time. And I'm going to use Photoshop to color it. But when I saw this drawing, I said, you know what? I think the golden section actually is right on you can fit your whole drawing into the golden section. You don't need to do many repetitions inside the golden section itself. So it turned out that I was correct. And the best thing, so he took and he started to look at them as the whole thing, as a manifestation of the golden section. So the one that worked the best, we decided, was the tiger or the dragon. And notice the golden section here, this is the golden section. How you construct the golden section. It's a rectangle that divides up. The proportions are 1.6. So the whole thing is 1.6, and this part is 0.6, and this part is the 1. So you have a square and a rectangle, and you just keep on repeating. Well, this is the whole rectangle, the golden section rectangle, the whole thing. And then this is the remaining rectangle, which can also be divided up into a square and a rectangle, which can also be divided up into a square and a rectangle, and so forth. So he realized that I was correct. This animal that he had drawn is the golden section. So he ended up simply taking this figure that he'd drawn and starting to color it in different ways. And I really liked the end of it. It was quite, well, I think he was from a South American country. And to me, these were really beautiful and very, intense in terms of color. So you are not going to use any white or black in your final color application. I would prefer that you stay just with, it can be a really, really light color or a really, really dark color, but no white or black, because I want you to set up situations where you're coloring just with color, not white or black, because it's too easy to do things with white or black. So in this case, the dark color is a very, very, very dark violet or red. I can't remember, I think it's red. And this was the one I liked the best, I think. There were others. Oh, whoops. Let's see if I can find. Yeah, so. Okay, one more example that I'll show you. I think I'll just maybe, okay, let's see. I did come up with some examples in the other class, I think. So here's would you like to see a geometric or a more realistic one?
A realistic one, maybe.
Okay, here's a guy who was a very young student who came into Art Center as a illustration major, but he ended up, here's his thumbnails for this project. He did a bunch of little drawings in his sketchbook. And he was interested in Seymour Chvast, who was sort of a cartoonist of the 50s. So he did these bunch of drawings. But I think he really, even though this was a mandala, this was a shell with some kind of golden section Fibonacci sequence called Endless Island. This was the one that I liked the best and that I think he liked the best. And it was a picture, a little drawing of a man eating with a spoon. And I said, what was that? What is that? Well, then he wrote about it. So in part B, I'll read you what he wrote because it was pretty interesting. So I didn't even know about this system before I think he's become a filmmaker now. The lute of Pythagoras. I created a motif based on a type of fractal known as the lute of Pythagoras. The lute is essentially a progression of pentagons, each containing a pentagram. Each new pentagram in the series fits into the inner corners of the last, continually becoming smaller and smaller. This allows for an infinite repetition of shapes. The sides of the lute are based on the number pi, which is the irrational number that creates the golden ratio. Any line in the lute, when measured, will be the ratio of pi. Pi, otherwise known as the golden ratio, can be found in everything from art and architecture to humans and plants. Although heavily associated with the Greeks, particularly the mathematician Pythagoras, pi was first understood by the ancient Egyptians, who used it in the proportions of the pyramids. In terms of the aesthetic of my motif, I drew upon illustrators, designers like Milton Glaser, Victor Morosco, and particularly Seymour Chast, whose colorful and playful cartoon style illustrations inspired me. I additionally saw this project as a good opportunity to create a visual pun, a man eating himself, which greatly interests me. So there's his drawing, and I want you to do some kind of drawing. You can do it, use a photographic motif and draw over it, or however you want to do that. And then that was part B, where you explain how you're going to do this. And these were his final pieces in color. And what was interesting was that when we saw them as a class, these were the complementary ones. So he notice here, like Andrea did, he left, he made his piece. This is not going to be repeated many times. This was the final piece. And he applied these colors. He took them from blends that he made in Illustrator, and then he took some colors and made some darker and lighter ones. When we saw these in class, we realized that some were more successful than others. So these are his complementary ones. And then he did, these were his analogous ones. At the time, as I said, I was only having people do complementary and analogous, but it's become much more interesting with doing a monochromatic and triadic one also. So we'll have to talk about that. But so here's his analogous ones. And obviously this one doesn't work too well since you can hardly see it. And this one's kind of boring. So I ended up telling him that I thought, especially since the artists that influenced him were from the 50s and 60s, that I thought his complementary one worked the best, the one that was done in these colors. And it really got a lot of attention because it's kind of weird, a man eating his own brains. And it ended up in the president's office for a while. We just mounted it, we put it on, he put it on board, he printed it a little bit bigger. And we just mounted it on board, well, now you're using the corrugated board, but at the time we were just using foam core. But it is really pretty bizarre, and he drew the whole thing. So it definitely was a good, outcome of this project, in that one pentagram fitting inside another. The whole idea of a man eating his own brains is very circular, right? In South America, there's a snake that eats his own tail in a lot of the Mayan reliefs, I think, or Aztec reliefs. And it's a very important symbol in a large part of the world, this idea of circularity and recurrence. And the whole idea of a snake eating itself is bizarre, right? But it also has a lot of symbolism.
It's called the Ouroboros.
Oh, did you use that too?
Yeah, I
Jennifer,
did.
yeah. Tell us a little bit about that creature.
It's just like a symbol that basically like signifies infinity. So there's like, so just a cycle of birth and death, and it eats itself, and it's like, yeah, like death, like snakes do that when they kill themselves. Actually, it's really fun. It's really interesting.
So
But
Jennifer,
that's what that means.
yeah, the also Boros it's called?
Ouroboros, like Ouroboros.
Wow. Yeah, Jennifer did a really beautiful piece with the photograph of that snake, and she did it in greens and blues. I don't know if I can find it, but yeah, so I'm trying to find you, Jennifer. There you are right here with an odd, all sorts of colliding shapes. So some of you put yourselves in front of and
Oh
behind.
yeah,
It's a
I
really
made that behind me.
wow. But you know what it looks like in your photograph? It looks like you're sort of transparent in front of it.
Yeah, I know. I don't know why it does that to my face, but
I'm going to show you more from the last few years next time. I think I've given you a lot to think about.
So next class, what is exactly the homework we gotta bring back? Like the idea, or we gotta bring back like the whole project?
I'd like you to do parts A and B.
Okay.
So A is the motif, and that can be image, photographic, geometric, but you know what? You need to start thinking about the system too, because your motif and the system are kind of interlocked. You know, some motifs don't make very
I mean,
good.
for example, what would be the motif on the Japanese system, the 2-to-1 ratio? Like,
You could have a very simple motif. One person who did that actually looked into the whole history of Japanese martial art, and they did it with swords. So in the middle, there was a cross sword, and in the area around, I forget, I'll try to find that piece. So the Japanese 2-to-1 system, it's just simply using that ratio over and over again. So there's always two long rectangles with a top or a bottom. I mean, the idea is that you have, look it up, Alex, research it.
I mean, I was doing this, but it is, I mean, I was thinking about the motive that I don't get it, but yeah, okay.
So what you choose might be related in some way to the history of that system. People have also come up with their own systems that somehow work. For instance, one kid, this was very unusual, was involved with acupuncture, and he had there in acupuncture, in the history of acupuncture, they're in one part of acupuncture practice, they believe that the hand represents the whole body. So if you understand exactly different parts of the hand, you can poke needles in different parts of the hand and actually heal the body. So yeah. He did a geometric depiction of the hand, and it related in some way to the system of belief of healing through acupuncture on the hand. Any case, basically we're going for something that ends up with an image that's visually engaging and attractive and interesting and beautiful. So how does that happen? Well, you are visual artists. That's first and foremost, you're a visual artist, right? So this is a way to create a visual image that will, you know, be superlative. Just remember that. It's not really, I'm not really as fixed on your understanding the math of it. And I said before, you don't have to understand the math I'm asking you to put a motif into that diagrammatic system.
Okay.
Hey, Joan.
Yes.
Well, I noticed that one of the motif options was a mirror. Would doing something like doing a photographic diptych be a possibility for this project?
Absolutely. And you might want to study ways in which reflection and duality were used in human image making.
Okay.
I mean, I guess you could go back to the story of Narcissus, or no, who was the person who looked into the water and saw his own reflection?
I think that's it. That sounds about right.
But you know, that's sort of one of the aspects of this. And then the idea of duality, yin yang, all the ways in which duality have played a part in human visual art.
Yeah.
But I mean, visual art is tied in with humanism or history of humans, right? So you can't really pull it apart in this assignment completely. Like I'm saying, I love the looks of this chest that I asked to inherit, and I lived with it for 20 years before I figured out that, or I wanted to really know the history of the symbols. You know, I mean, it's important, but it's not, for me, the visual beauty of this chest was more important to me than actually knowing. But now I know, and it's really even more meaningful. So, but I am looking at your use of the system to generate an image.
Okay.
So you might try a few things. You know, you might not hit on the thing that you want to spend the whole 3 weeks doing right away. It might take you a few days to figure this out. But you're right now you're drawing ideas. If you're photographers, you can just take photos that you might work. You might take a photo of some windows. You might take a photo of the tree, of a branch. You might take photos of leaves. I don't know. You might take a photo of liquid. You know, I don't know what would fit into what you intend to do, but you have to use your own processes of association, I think, to figure this out.
Okay.
Okay.
It's really meant, you know, it's actually a fun project, and it is a little bit more analytical maybe than most of them have been, but yeah.
Cool.